All right, so we are going to finish up our stuff on World War II with the exception of the Holocaust, because we'll revisit that with an assignment here on the next day or so. So we've talked about kind of the Allied pressure on the Germans primarily, as we've seen the tide turn. We've talked about all the things they have to do to kind of defeat Germany and kind of get, or at least begin defeating Germany. So all that build up, all that manufacturing on the home front is doing a really great job to kind of overwhelm the Germans with numbers, all right? So describing the goals for the Allies to win and analyze why different strategies were used and looking at how we defeat both Germany and Japan. All right. So when we talk about the American ability to actually rebuild stuff or to build stuff, when despite all the destruction going on, um, the great arsenal of democracy is really in effect when we talk about this massive invasion of Western Europe and all the information, all the supplies that we can bring in. All right. Seeing the endless array of ships, that's why I knew that Germany would lose the war because of all the technology, all the supplies that essentially the United States has limitless supplies of. All right. As well as all the troops that we can amass against them. All right. So our invasion of Normandy happened here. All right, and it took about 2 months to actually kind of secure all this territory right here, and we haven't really gotten much further. So beginning in August 1st, 1944, about 2 months after D-Day, we then break out of this kind of hole because the German army, or a lot of the German reinforcements, were up here because that was the closest distance. That's where Germany, even after D-Day, was like, well, that's just kind of a feint attack. We know that there are more American forces over here. So really great trick by the United States and the British to kind of convince the Germans that we were going to do a main invasion over here, or a second invasion that was going to be more important, much closer to their main forces. So that never happened, so the Germans were actually pretty slow in their response in terms of getting back at it. So as we break out, and by middle of August, beginning of September, we have taken Paris. We pretty much by middle of September, almost all of France is back in Allied hands, which is pretty awesome. And we've moved into Belgium, and we've done this invasion here in southern France. We've pulled troops from Italy to kind of again put the pressure on and really get closer and closer. However, because most of the Allied supplies are in England or back here in Normandy, where we had that 2-month buildup, by the time we're at the front lines here in Luxembourg and on the German border and in the Netherlands, and early to mid-September, they have to go several hundred miles. Like this right here is 200 miles, 200 miles. You got to get like 600 miles of supplies right to the front where they need ammunition, they need tank shells, they need fuel to keep pushing, and they're running dry because all of these other ports that they're capturing are so far behind and the Germans are destroying them. All right. So while Germany was having issues bringing stuff to the front because of the fact that, the Allies dominated the skies, the biggest thing that we were seeing is now that we're getting closer to Germany, their main industries are right here. They're able to just supply their people right at the front with reinforcements, new equipment, more fuel. And so, again, Hitler's had essentially about 15 years or so, or really 13, 12 years to prepare for an Allied invasion of Germany. So as the Allies get closer, they're about to run into a wall of German defenses that Germany can now use and stop this Allied advance after this massive gain of kind of liberating France late in 1944. All right, so war comes close to a stalemate, and that Red Ball Express reading, which I hope you've taken a look at by now, used to transport most of the fuel and supplies to the front. So those reserves, those backup people, these African-American people working in the Red Ball Express are completely essential to bringing supplies forward to the Allies, all right, to the American, French, Canadian, and British troops along this front. Pretty much nonstop, transportation to and from the front to bring all this stuff there. All right. So in the meantime, as the war slows down in November and October 1944, Germany is essentially planning for one last big offensive to help try and bring the British and the Americans out of the war so they can focus on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is always the biggest target of the Germans. All right, that's who they are fearing for the worst because of the atrocities they committed against the Russians and what the atrocities that the Russians are committing against them. So what happens in December 1944 when the weather is really, really bad, Germany attacks in the exact same spot that they attacked France in 1940, taking them completely by surprise in winter across this very weakened Allied front, kind of on the border of Germany and Belgium, and they're trying to cut the British and American forces in half in hopes of getting them to surrender, as well as get all this fuel and oil and try and bring the war to an end. And it's known as the Battle of the Bulge because, how else do you describe the look of this battle, right? And initially, within the first 24 hours, the Germans have a lot of success breaking through with the Ardennes forest. However, they have issues of getting their supplies across. There is not enough fuel going around. The Allied defenses, while bad and understaffed, they're able to put up enough resistance to slow down the Germans where they don't ever get really close to cutting all the Allied forces in half. And in fact, it actually takes about 6 weeks to a month, or 2 months almost, for the Allies to reestablish the line and push the Germans all the way back. In fact, at one point, the 101st Airborne Division with a few tank battalions that surrounded the town of Bastogne, which was this massive transport hub that had a bunch of roads going in and out that the Germans wanted because it would just be easier to transport things through. They get surrounded, but it's enough to, again, slow down the German army and the German advance. And a lot of people think that this is actually something that actually brought the war actually closer to an end because the Germans wasted so many resources and valuable troops and everything on this thing that went nowhere, right? So the Bulge eventually collapses and the Allies are able to push them back in February, but now we have to get across into Germany, all right? So, unfortunately, this is kind of more anticlimactic to the way that the war ends. Germany is in fact defeated by the end of April, beginning of May 1945. So the Allies are able to get across, at least the British and the Americans are able to get across with both paratroopers and capturing a few bridges across, and then being able to completely move their advance. While the Soviets, we were talking last time, here where they were, 1943, Stalingrad, pushed all the way here. They've moved into Russia or Romania and Bulgaria. They've moved into Poland. And they're the ones who get into Berlin. And Hitler, rather than surrendering, kills himself. The German army, figuring that most of the leaders are like, well, this is kind of a hopeless war, are trying to surrender. And most of them will try and surrender to the Allies or to the Americans and the British for hopes of better treatment. And they surrender on May 8th, known as VE Day or Victory in Europe Day. Well, I guess that's kind of anticlimactic to kind of how things end, but essentially, Berlin itself here is destroyed. It was pretty much guerrilla warfare, tactic, fighting street to street kind of thing. While on the western side, the Germans just kind of collapsed as the Allies again pushed forward. So this result is something we're going to talk about with the next unit when we get to the Cold War. All right. So in the meantime, let's go back, flipping over to Japan for our island hopping issues, or island hopping strategy. So after Battle of Midway, okay, here we are over here, all right, where we've destroyed much of the Japanese carrier fleet, then we begin to, press against the Japanese, which have gained all of this territory. Guadalcanal being down here, Battle of the Coral Sea down here, all of that which had stopped the Japanese advances. So we're doing our island hopping, trying to get closer to Japan and starting to bomb them. All right, which means we got to take a bunch of these different islands to get ourselves closer. All right. However, the Japanese, most of their fleet is destroyed here in the Battle of the Leyte Gulf, trying to reinforce and hold on to the Philippines, which they take from the United States in 1942. All right, it's the largest naval battle ever, and essentially destroyed what was left of the Japanese Navy. All right. The Philippines, which had surrendered in 1942, where General MacArthur, who we'll revisit again during the Cold War, was forced to abandon it. He vowed that he was going to return, which he does do in 44 and 45, as the Americans are, again, essentially doing this. Over here, the Japanese are being pushed back by Indian troops as well as the British through what is, Myanmar, what was then Burma, Thailand, and again, forcing the Japanese back. The Chinese are fighting as hard as they can to, again, essentially shut down the Japanese war machine. All right. However, and so one of the things that unfortunately happened within the Philippines that we haven't really talked about yet was their mistreatment of prisoners. That kind of, the idea that surrender is a very bad thing. It's dishonorable. The worst thing you could do is survive and surrender and be captured. So Japanese troops really abhor American troops and other troops who surrender and really treat them very poorly. One example was with Bataan, which is, this peninsula in the Philippines, where they forced 70,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war on this long march, and so many of them died that it was actually considered a war crime. All right, there's a reading, again, that's up on Schoology. Definitely take a look at it, just for the atrocities that were committed there. So, as we're getting closer to Japan, the more desperate the Japanese soldiers are fighting to defend their soil. All right, they would rather die than be taken prisoner, and so if they can kill or attack or take down one American, that is worth it for the Japanese. That's kind of their code of honor, what they've been taught. All right, so the closer we're getting, the more difficult it is to take down the Japanese. So at Iwo Jima, which occurs in February and March 1945, where we see this iconic flag raising over here, gives the U.S. an airbase to begin to firebomb Japan, this time with napalm, which is kind of a liquid jelly thing that actually lights a bunch of buildings on fire, to with more targets and increased civilian casualties, and gives, again, the Americans the advantage to attack Japan more directly. All right? So that was a 34-day battle for an island that's about pretty much 3 miles. An island that's about 3 miles, that's square miles. It's not a whole lot, but it cost the Americans several thousands of troops and 3 weeks of battle. All right, Okinawa, which is considered the first home Japanese island, there's like 4,000 actual islands that belong to Japan, considered part of their homeland. Okinawa is the first island that we capture that is to use to jump away the invasion of Japan. But again, it's even worse. 12,000 Americans are killed, about 30,000 Japanese, and about 100,000 Okinawan residents, civilians, are killed as a result of the fighting. So it's getting worse and worse and worse. All right? And then the damage over here, Japan begins to, in 1944, use their airplanes, load them up with a bunch of TNT, a bunch of explosives, and ram the planes into ships and just take out as many Americans as possible. All right? So the kamikazes are trying to essentially destroy and kill as many as they can to force a surrender or a peace that will give them the advantage. So in terms of, the idea here's Iwo Jima, Okinawa is over here, and here is mainland Japan. All right? So some clips you might want to consider watching in terms of their battle. So here is the Battle of the Tenero River from the Pacific miniseries, much like Band of Brothers, on the Battle of Guadalcanal. The idea of what the Japanese mentality is like from the American perspective, and the battle from the movie Letters from Iwo Jima about how they don't fight the Americans initially when they land, but instead drawing the Americans in with these prepared positions and make it even worse. All right? So the debate becomes, do we invade Japan? Is it going to be worth it? All right? The casualties are building up more and more and more. And, we want to bring this war to an end. Germany has surrendered. Well, what we end up deciding, and this is President Truman, because unfortunately President Roosevelt, after being elected to a historic fourth term, dies in April 1945. He had been in some, health issues for a very long time. The war did not help with that. So rather than the idea of an invasion of Japan, if we can avoid it, the United States drops the first 2 atomic bombs ever used in warfare, and the only 2 that have ever been used in warfare that were created through the Manhattan Project, where we invested over $2 billion with resources across the country to see, could we actually create a nuclear reaction that would cause this explosion and hopefully take Japan out of the war and not risk as many Japanese lives, but also American lives too. So the targets were Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were both military targets. Unfortunately, a lot of civilians were killed, obviously, unfortunately. But they were also cities that were not heavily attacked through other means. We've been firebombing a lot of Japanese cities, including Tokyo, Kyoto, and other places. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki were left pretty wide open. They hadn't really been attacked, so this way you can gauge the furthest amount of the damage. So Hiroshima is attacked on April 6th with the atomic bomb, Nagasaki on April 9th. So in those 2 bombings, just 2 bombs, over 250,000 Japanese died from the direct bombing and the subsequent radiation in the next days, weeks, months, and years. And so this is what forces Japan to surrender. All right? And one of the things that you're going to be asked to do is to look at the decision behind the bombings of that, and was it justified? What was kind of the reasoning behind that? All right? And the decision, was made by President Truman. All right? So Japan then surrenders on August 15th. 1945, victory over Japan Day, VJ Day. So that brings us to this. Last thing we're going to talk about in the final video for World War II, the punishments for Japan and Germany, as well as the Holocaust. So Stay tuned for those.